Okay, now I'm not saying this because I want to make you fearful or worried or panic in any way, shape, or form, because I'm absolutely going to help you sort this out. But something that I have noticed for a lot of online marketers, particularly those who use content marketing and content creation as a way of attracting audience members and making sales, is that they are sabotaging the success of that content and they don't even realize that that's what they're doing. And so I wanted to do a podcast episode where I actually uncover and help you to see how you might be sabotaging your content and fix it quickly in just a short, sharp episode. So if you are someone who creates content, whether it's for social media or podcasts like this or blogs for your website or you run webinars or whatever it might be, I want you to listen to this podcast episode so that we can ensure you're not sabotaging that content's success. This is episode number 411 of the Heart Centered Business Podcast, and all of the relevant links and show notes for today's episode can be found at tashcorbin.com/411. And I want you to make sure that you note that down because I've got a free resource for you today that I think you'll find very helpful. Let's dive into this one because I want to make sure we end this sabotage today. I'm Tash Corbin, and this is the Heart Centered Business Podcast. So, the big sabotage that I want to talk about today is the experience that you may have had before where you do all this work of creating content. You create a new freebie, or you create a bunch of podcast episodes, or you create social media posts and you are thinking about your ideal clients and you're putting nice imagery with it, right? You're doing all of this work to create fresh content, new content, thoughtful content for your audience because you use content marketing as part of your business strategy. But it's not actually just the existence of that content that does the job of attracting, warming up, and converting your audience into paying clients. The content existing doesn't do all of the job. It actually needs to be distributed, right? There's two parts to this: content creation and content distribution. And so the sabotage that I see people unwittingly doing to their content is they create that content and they don't share it, or they don't share it widely and thoroughly enough, or they only share it once. That's it. And so that is the content sabotage that we are going to sort out in this very short, sharp episode of the Heart Centered Business Podcast, because it's the distribution of your content that allows that content to do its job. And yet, there are so many people who put time and energy and effort into creating these processes to create amazing content, and they're optimizing their content and they're making sure their content is speaking to their exact right clients, and they're doing courses on how to create better content and how to create more content and do podcasts. And now they're going to share on different platforms. And they're creating all of this stuff, but then the content is just shared once or it's not shared effectively. And so you're doing all this work on the content creation side, but your distribution is sorely lacking. And so there's no hope of that content actually doing an effective job of attracting an audience, warming up an audience, or converting an audience into paying customers. So that is what we're going to sort out in this podcast episode, because I want you, if you're going to all the effort of making amazing content, or at least crafting any kind of content, let's ensure you've got a distribution strategy that does it some justice and gives it a maximized opportunity to get in front of the right people and do its job. The content doesn't work if no one's absorbing that content, if no one's consuming it. And it's distribution that maximizes the consumption of your content. So we are going to sort out content distribution. So there are 4 stages of distributing your content that you've created. And this is the same whether it's content for social media, podcast episodes, webinars, free resources, whatever it might be. There's 4 phases. Phase number 1 is initial distribution. So I'll use my podcast episodes as an example here. So when this podcast episode is completed, it will go into the schedule to be distributed by being released as a podcast episode. That will go into the podcast feed of anyone who's subscribed to the podcast. Subscribe, rate, and review if you want to add it to yours. Just chuck that little plug in there. But it will also be distributed because I will send it to my email list, which is actually more people than the subscribers to my podcast. So I will also send it out to my email list to let them know that this podcast episode exists, why they should listen to it, and just plop it in front of them in case it might be something that's valuable to them. Then I also pre-write 2 social media posts, and my team schedule those out to tell people on social media on my primary platform, which is my Facebook page, that this podcast episode exists and why they should go and listen to it, and give them a little teaser or, create some kind of interest or intrigue around it so people are interested to go and check it out and maybe listen to it. So when I initially release this podcast episode, its initial distribution is not just it goes to my subscribers and it's got some good keywords in case anyone's searching. I'm not waiting for people to search for this content. I'm distributing this content so that people can actually find it, and I'm telling them actively about it. So I'm not just sharing it with my subscribers to the podcast. I'm also sharing it to my list. I'm sharing it on socials to my existing audience. But I also will promote this podcast episode to people in some of the Facebook groups that I'm in if I'm posting in Facebook groups that week. I don't use that as a consistent part of my my content distribution strategy these days because I mostly focus on more scalable strategies. But in the early stages of this podcast, I shared the podcast episode in like 7 groups every week on the days where I could promote podcast episodes because I wanted to maximize the distribution of the podcast. But so many people don't do this for their content. They're creating all this content, they're putting all this thought and energy and effort into it, and then they don't distribute it. They don't distribute it far enough. They don't tell people about it. Now, there are other ways that you could distribute using the different initial distribution strategies. You could send a message to your biz besties and say, hey, I've got this new podcast episode and I think people in your audience might be interested in it. So here's the link in case you're able to share it. That's also distribution. And even though I said, I'm not just going to wait for people to search for it, being found when people are searching for that content is a great way to distribute your content as well in the initial sharing phase. So if you're going to go to the effort of creating a podcast episode, at least think about what the key terms people would be searching would be if this podcast episode is the kind of thing that they want to find. So a little bit of keyword optimization, a little bit of thought about where people might search for it and what they might be searching for if you want them to find this as the result is a great way of maximizing that initial distribution of your podcast episode. So that's initial, right? That's on the first week that the podcast is released. But phase 2 is the reshare. So when I am doing future podcast episodes, if I refer to anything about content distribution or not sabotaging your content creation process, I might do a podcast episode in the future about how to create really amazing content that everyone loves and that gets people's attention. Well, then I will refer back to this podcast episode. So, and don't forget, creating the content is phase 1, you got to get that done, but let the content do its job. Don't sabotage your results by not distributing the content. And then I'll refer people back to this podcast episode. So I'm creating this kind of loop back process where if people are listening to something that's related, I'm linking them back to this podcast episode, but also in a couple of months' time, I'm going to have new subscribers. I'm going to have new people following me on socials. I might have new people on my mailing list. So at the end of the month, I do my podcast roundup, which is here's the podcast episode you might have missed. And my second phase of distribution is resharing the content. So I don't just share the podcast episode the week it's released. I share it a few weeks after it's released in my end of month roundup, as well as doing a pre-scheduled promo for it on my socials. But it also goes into my content plan for future posts on socials and future ways that I can roll out the podcast episode as well. So I don't just have my initial distribution, I have the resharing distribution further down the track. Then stage 3 is repurposing. So every single podcast episode that I record is transcribed, and a lovely article version of the podcast is on my website, and a copy of that article is popped into a file folder in my Dropbox in my computer, where when I am looking to create social content or other types of content, or if I'm looking to create new stuff, I can refer back to some of the things I've created and shared that are on the same topic or with the same keywords, because it's a searchable database. So I can create a future podcast episode that sort of shares a similar message. So I could create a podcast episode on 4 stages to distributing your content so it does its job effectively. I could be creating a webinar on content creation and distribution in the future, and I've got all of these words about content distribution and these 4 phases of distribution, so I can use that in a future podcast. So content repurposing is a really powerful way to redistribute the same thought process, the same idea, the same strategies, the same tips, the same steps, but in a different format or with a different search term or in a different way, so that different people in your audience either have a chance to listen to it again or relearn or have that embedded, but also it might attract new people because it's shared with a different focal point, or it's shared with a different theme, or it's shared using different terms. And so that repurposing is another great way of making sure that this one genius idea, this one amazing concept I have for you, is actually shared over and over again. It's distributed more than once. And then the 4th stage is putting it into my content bank. So it becomes an ongoing asset in my business that can do its job over and over and over again. So podcast episodes are also embedded on my website. So this one is at tashcorbin.com/411. So if someone is searching on Google for something about podcast content or content distribution or content strategy or sabotaging my content or whatever it might be, there's a likelihood that this content might come up. Also, I will have this categorized. So if people are listening to future podcast episodes and it suggests another podcast that's on this same category, this asset may be suggested. In addition, I have every single episode of my podcast indexed in a content bank with the key information about that podcast episode. So if someone ever asks me a question and I'm like, oh, actually, I've got a podcast on that, I can quickly find out what the podcast number is and say, here's the podcast episode. It's tashcorbin.com/411. And so now, instead of having to answer this question or walk people through podcast distribution or content distribution over and over and over again, this podcast can do the job for me and continue to nurture and grow my relationship with my audience and help people move forward with their content and make sure that they're not sabotaging their content's ability to get its jobs done, without me having to one-on-one walk people through that process and explain what content distribution is, what the 4 phases are, because the podcast does that for me. So I've now turned an action, recording the podcast, into an asset, the podcast episode being shareable, searchable, reshareable, indexed, easy for me to refind and repurpose, just by putting it into that content bank and thinking about it as an asset, not just a one-off piece of content that was distributed at the time and now it's out of date. So when it comes to distribution, one of the biggest challenges that people have is that it can start to create this sense of all or nothing thinking, though. I've just told you all these different ways that you can distribute one piece of content. But what can happen is that you then go, oh, well, if I don't distribute this content 40,000 times over the next 3 years, then it might as well not exist. And so then they stop creating content altogether. I do not want that to happen for you. I want you to continue creating content, but I also want you to maximize the effectiveness of that content doing its job by ensuring that you distribute it. So there are two factors that come into play when it comes to the effectiveness of that distribution, because not all content distribution strategies have an equal impact, an equal audience size, an equal quality of audience that it actually gets in front of, and the effectiveness of its doing its job. So I want you to think about the quantity of content that you create and distribute and the quantity of times that you distribute that same piece of content versus the quality of that content and the distribution channels that you focus on. So whilst I understand that pinning my podcast episodes into Pinterest is something that a lot of SEO people get very excited about and Pinterest mentors get very excited about, the time and energy or money that it takes for me to pin my podcast content, come up with all the pins, repin other people's stuff, manage my pin boards, all that kind of stuff, for me is not worth the return on investment compared to some of the other strategies that I find are far more my zone of genius and far more aligned for my audience. So I don't do every single possible content distribution strategy. I focus on how can I find the best quality of content distribution strategy for my audience and for my content to do a really good job in the most efficient and effective way possible. One brilliantly written reshare of my podcast is better than creating 16 terrible dialed in social media posts that I schedule out once a week for the next 16 weeks. So I need to be mindful of my distribution strategy being a good distribution strategy for my audience, for my content, for my zone of genius, for the medium of content that I've chosen to create, versus the quantity of places and reshares and ways that I can share that again and again and again into the future and redistribute. So when it comes to repurposing my podcast episodes, for example, I do not use AI to turn podcast episodes into dozens of different posts for social media. The quality of the content that AI creates out of my podcast episodes is abysmal. And before all the AI lovers get in touch and tell me that it's my quality of prompts or I'm using the wrong tool or blah, 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 whatever it is, I've made an informed decision based on what my audience values, what my values are, and my unwillingness to give over the IP of my podcast episodes into AI tools. Because there's a difference between AI scraping my podcast episodes off the internet uninvited versus me actively submitting my podcast episodes to AI and saying, here you go, you are now the owner of this AI and of this IP, and you can use this to your heart's content to inform other people's questions about the things that I'm an expert in. That's a very different experience, and that's a very different decision. So I don't like low quality, unthought out, just dialed in pieces of content being thrown at social media. I also know that my audience don't respond very well to those types of social media content. And in the past, I have asked my team to just write a little intro or use the intro of the podcast episode to promote a podcast episode on socials. And for months and months and months on end, those posts were the lowest reach, lowest engaged posts on my socials over and over again. Every month we collect what are the top 10 posts on my socials, what are the bottom 3. podcast sharing posts were the bottom 3 over and over and over again. And so instead of continuously asking my team to write terrible content that promoted my podcast episodes, I decided I'll just write 2 really good promo posts that are really engaging, really well thought out, have a nice, strong opening line, and I'll do a great job of it, and we'll do it twice, and we'll choose quality over quantity. And we'll put it in the asset bank and have other ways to repurpose and reuse it and reshare it down the track that also have high quality content that goes with it or use a high quality approach. And nowadays, my posts where I talk about my podcast episodes on my Facebook page are some of my top 10 posts most months because I chose quality over quantity. So that's definitely something to have a think about. And also, sometimes people get very excited about distribution in terms of quantity because of the size of the audience. But there's a difference between getting your content in front of 10,000 people who don't care about what you do versus getting your content in front of 100 people who will hang off every word, love every second of what you share, get very excited, and then go and hunt down more content from you because they love your opinion. So not all audiences are quality audiences, and not all audiences have an equal weighting when it comes to numbers. So there's an audience of mine that has 10,000 people plus in it. It is a very engaged audience. It's a very, very highly connected audience. I love them a lot. I am very mindful of not taking their attention for granted, and I'm very mindful of how much content I put in front of them. And then there's another audience of mine that is well over 10,000 people, not particularly interested in my stuff, not particularly engaged, don't have a very high read rate or engagement rate, doesn't really, do a lot for my business. The first one is my mailing list. The second one is the Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs Facebook group. Now, Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs is actually over 30,000 people, and a lot of people can't understand why I don't hog the microphone more in that group. Talk about yourself more, share your content more, share your podcast more, put more time into trying to talk to that audience, Most of that audience is not there to hear from me because the group is not called Tash Corbin audience. The group is called Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs. The value proposition of that group is that everyone has an equal and fair opportunity with the microphone and that we are there to support and encourage each other. And I'm part of that group as a peer. And so the time and energy that I put into distributing my content in that space is actually far less than the time and energy that I put into distributing my content with my mailing list. Because my mailing list have signed up because they want to hear from me. They want to learn from me. They're interested in my take on strategy. They're interested in getting my advice on how they can grow their audience or make more sales or improve their offers. Whereas people don't join the Heart Center group because of what they get to hear from me. Most people initially join the Heart Center community because they want to say something. They want to share something. They want to promote something. And I can help improve the effectiveness of that promo, and I can help them reach more people within that community, and I can help them make more sales. But am I going to do that for free for a very loosely engaged audience that doesn't necessarily have any clue who I am? Or am I going to save the juiciest of that content for my mailing list and my podcast subscribers? I'm going to save it for my most engaged audience. So just be mindful of where you have your most engaged audience, your warmest audience, your, that quality of audience can sometimes greatly outweigh the quantity of audience that you could potentially get in front of in other channels. Now, of course, when it comes to creating content that is going to get lots of engagement and really add value for your audience and move them closer to buying from you, we do want to ensure that we're creating content that's going to do a great job. If we're going to go to the effort of distributing it, let's make sure we make content that's quite optimized to do its job. If you aren't sure whether you've got a great content creation strategy, if your messaging is not quite strong enough, or you're not 100% sure that you're really hitting the mark when it comes to expressing the work that you do and how you can help people and why they should buy from you, make sure that you go to the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/411, because over there I will pop the link to a free resource, which is my core messaging template, and that will help you map out those key elements of your core messages. And if you incorporate and weave those through the content that you're distributing, it is going to be far more likely to be doing that job of attracting a great audience, warming that audience, and moving them closer to buying from you. So make sure you go and grab that, tashcorbin.com/411. And then once you've created that spectacular content, you're going to do an amazing job of distributing it with those 4 phases of the initial distribution, maximizing that, resharing so that you're not just getting it in front of your audience one time, repurposing it so that you're looking at it from different angles and using different keywords and search terms, or using it in different mediums and formats, and then making sure it goes into a content bank, whether it's a social post or it's a podcast episode or it's a blog or it's a webinar that you've run, making sure that that content goes into a content bank that you can search and index and have there to reuse, repurpose, reshare forevermore, so that it can keep doing a spectacular job for your business. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart Centered Business Podcast. Until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now. Would you like more tips, tools, and resources to help you grow your heart-centered business? Head to tashcorbin.com today.